Good afternoon. Welcome to our attendees and our three panelists today to this third edition of I Meet Hotel webinar. My name is Caroline Dal'lin and I'm Director of Business Development for Bidroom. Let me introduce you first to our panelists before getting started. So this webinar will feature Rob Gurney, who's CEO at OneWorld. Welcome, Rob. Thank you for being with us in this early morning from New York. Then we have with us Sergio Merino, co-founder at iVisa and live from Madrid today.
Hello.
Hi, Sergio. And then Stig Williams, Head of International Partnerships at Avis Budget Group.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Stig. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining. Before we move forward with our presentations, I would like to introduce the subject of today's webinar. So predictions of travel, including potential future regulations and recovery. Well, we can all agree that COVID-19 has changed our lives, but the question is for how much time and how much it will impact our lives in the long run as travelers. So nobody knows what will happen next week or in the next 3 years. So we don't intend today, of course, to give you exact predictions. That would be foolish, but we mainly intend to assess where we stand at the moment and what are some likely developments coming our way in the next few weeks or months. So I would like to share a few facts to introduce the context before panelists share their view on these different points and these different aspects of the crisis. So in terms of the airlines at the moment worldwide are losing approximately 1.6 billion US dollars per day. We have on one side the optimists like Michael Leary, the head of Ryanair, saying that in 2021 we will be flying on holiday again with double enthusiasm, spreading vision of a smooth return to normality. And on the other side, we have seen prediction of higher prices, complicated paperwork for passengers and lower capacity. When it comes to hospitality, well, the most impacted sector of activity, I would say, in this crisis, with Marriott estimating 23% drop in its first quarter in revenue per room, and also 2/3 of 700,000 jobs lost in March in the US came actually from the hospitality sector. In terms of airport transportations, Emirates and Dubai Airport have introduced COVID-19 tests for passengers with results within 10 minutes. And passengers, as you know, are also required to wear their own mask when at the airport or in the aircraft, but also asked to follow social distancing guidelines. So I think many industry experts actually talking about the introduction of a health travel certificate. And I think, Sergio, you will actually develop a little bit on that subject later. In terms of the lockdown where we are at the moment, where the situation is very different, depending on the region where we are. Singapore just extended its lockdown to 1st of June, while France, for example, is aiming at opening slowly again on May 11th. So again, we're facing many different scenarios depending on the region of the world where we operate. French President Macron even suggested that the EU's external borders might be closed until the end of September in a Forbes interview. So the good news is that the social distancing policies around the world are beginning to show signs of positive effect in flattening the curve. So we need now to prepare for recovery. And there are a lot of guesses out there and a lot of different scenarios again. So in this context, I look forward to hearing from our panelists today. So to our audience, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We will answer it at the end of each presentation. And the conference will run for 1 hour, 3 times 15 minutes presentations. So let's get started with Rob Gurney, again, CEO at OneWorld Alliance.
Thank you. Just making sure I'm unmuted. And good afternoon, everybody. I think most of the people on this webinar are probably based in Europe. I don't know the complete spread of delegates. I'm on the East Coast of the United States, and it's a beautiful spring morning here. So welcome. And firstly, I hope you, your families and loved ones and colleagues are all safe and well, and please keep safe and well. So as Caroline said, for those that have joined us expecting some form of prediction around recovery, you're probably going to be disappointed, because I think it's very challenging to make any accurate predictions. But what I'm going to do today is step through some of the high-level industry data and trends. Caroline's already touched on the losses that aviation's incurring. I'll put some context around that shortly. Then once we go through that part of the presentation, we'll then talk through, well, what are the kind of key elements that we need to be thinking about with respect to recovery. And I'll talk to that in a reasonable amount of detail, and also talk about the advocacy and the work that OneWorld, but not just OneWorld, but the other airline alliances have been doing with IATA and other industry stakeholders and regulatory and government bodies. I'll also share some consumer sentiment research that's been prepared, and I think one of the things that we are starting to see is a significant amount of research being made publicly available. I would encourage everybody to make use of that. Again, it's an important measure of sentiment, but it's also useful to have a look at how sentiment is changing over time. So without further ado, I'll launch into the presentation. Just very briefly on OneWorld before I start. We're an airline alliance of some of the world's leading airlines, spread geographically across all of the major regions in the world. And the three global airline alliances combined comprise around 60% of the total airline capacity. So that's an interesting number just to keep at the back of your mind. And for some reason, I can't drive the slide. So I've already encountered a technical issue here. So let me try one more time. Nope. Here we go. Okay. So firstly, the graph on the right-hand side shows IATA's forecasts, IATA being the International Air Transport Association, at 3 points in time of revenue decline for global airlines. To put those numbers in context, for 2019, the total profits that the airline industry made globally was around $26 billion. So on the 5th of March, as you can see, IATA were forecasting a loss of around $113 billion. By the time we got to the middle of this month, that loss had almost trebled, or the estimated loss of revenues had almost trebled. A substantial reduction in capacity. And one thing that I will say about aviation, it is accustomed to managing crises. I think it's in the DNA of the people that work in the industry. Of course, no one's encountered a crisis of this magnitude in terms of the spread and the depth of it. But airlines did respond very quickly to the falling demand and reduce capacity very, very rapidly. You can see from the bullet points on the slide that by early April, globally almost 80% of flights have been grounded. Pretty much the industry is grounded. There are pockets, the US and some of the Asian short-haul markets, where there is a high percentage of capacity being operated by airlines, but it's still a material decline on where we were this time last year, or even this time 2 months ago. Looking at the US domestic market, what you can see there, and this is one of the markets where we are still seeing some level of flying, but the graph that you can see there, and this was produced by Airlines for America, which is the advocacy group that represents all of the major US carriers. What you can see on that graph is the top line shows the reduction in capacity over time from back to the 24th of February, and the accelerated decline in seats operated right up to the graph only takes us to the 4th of April. But you can see, in spite of that capacity being reduced at a rapid rate, the demand has fallen even faster. And that's pretty symptomatic of everything we're seeing around the world. There's been, essentially a collapse of demand caused by a number of factors. Underlying demand has fallen. but also significant travel restrictions, particularly internationally, as everyone's aware. I'll move on to the next slide. For our members, again, significant capacity reductions on both domestic and international networks. Some of our airlines have completely grounded their operations. Others have completely grounded their international operations, but are operating some domestic services. In the last 72 hours, we've seen the first major casualty of COVID-19, which was in Australia, with Virgin Australia going into administration. And that airline had been operating for close to 20 years. So we've seen already the first major casualty. Of course, airlines have responded quickly, not just reducing capacity, but also trying to conserve cash. The most important thing for any enterprise through this period is maintaining as much liquidity as possible. And of course, the entry restrictions, and we'll talk to this a little bit later, but the entry restrictions in many member airlines' home countries, including hubs, has been severely limited by a variety of government, both travel advisories and complete restrictions on traffic flows and passenger flows between countries. In terms of the macroeconomic impacts, and sorry, I apologize, it's a bit of a busy slide. But again, just looking at the tables, the first table on the top right-hand side shows a variety of forecasts from the various global economic think tanks and financial authorities, starting with the IMF down to the OECD. The interesting thing when you look at that, there's a fairly broad sort of consensus that the range of global GDP growth in 2020 is going to be down somewhere around the sort of 3% mark. I have to say some of those forecasts look to be, on the optimistic side. We obviously haven't seen any of the data that's going to flow through the second quarter of the year. But a significant decline, and possibly larger declines than what's forecast. Again, looking at some of the sentiment research, there was a piece of work that McKinsey had done, and interestingly, they took a survey in March and a survey in April. I don't have, excuse me, the exact dates when they took their data samples, but over that 4-week period, something like 22% more people that responded to the survey believe that there's going to be a significant contraction of the global economy. So back in March, there's around 5% of those people, and these are business leaders and other thought leaders globally, that they survey to take this temperature check, this pulse check. And as I say, back in March, around 5% believed there was going to be a severe contraction, and around 37% a moderate contraction. By April, that number was up to around 27%, believing there'd be a severe retraction, and around 40% a minimal retraction. So we'll come back to sentiment and economy in a moment. The numbers that you can see there in terms of unemployment data, the US, 22 million new filings in recent weeks, and that number is going to jump again. The UK, unemployed expected to rise up to 3.4 million, an additional 1.3 million from the 2.1. Germany, those numbers look quite low, but in Germany, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there's a government program that that does help employers continue to keep their employees employed by essentially subsidizing a significant part of their wage. And Australia, the unemployment rate's expected to rise up to around 10%. So the important thing of that, obviously everyone looks at the equity markets, and it has been, apart from the plunges that took place a month or so ago, there has been a bit of a roller coaster with sporadic increases and decreases in terms of the equity markets. But if you look at the underlying real economy and look at those unemployment numbers, they're the elements that I think point to what might happen with the real economy. Now, it's also important to point out that a number of those employees that have registered for unemployment insurance and other benefits, can potentially be re-employed. Some of those will be furloughed staff because the enterprises they work for have essentially come to a halt. Some of those will be furloughed staff that will be able to be re-employed relatively rapidly. But of course, that will come back to demand for the products and services that they offer. And of course, the unwinding of the various mobility restrictions that governments in nearly all the countries in the world have in place. And again, not to be, and believe me, I'm optimist by nature and definitely half glass full, and I'll turn to the positive in a short while. But the IMF is saying this will be the worst economic performance in 2020 since the Great Depression, where the global GDP shrank around 10% over that period from 1929 to 1932. In terms of the government response, and again, I think we've got to give governments a huge amount of credit for the size and the speed to which they've responded with economic stimulus and relief packages. And again, on the table on the right-hand side, I've just taken a snapshot of a number of countries, but the US, 2 trillion, and these are all at a point in time. It's I'm sure there will be a significant additional stimulus funding provided. In fact, there was a breakthrough yesterday in the US in terms of the 2 main political parties reaching some alignment on the next tranche of that. I don't have the full detail on the absolute economic contribution, but you can see already $2 trillion, which is 9.3% of the GDP for the US, which is, as you know, the largest economy in the world. So significant amount of funding being provided by governments, but also representing a significant portion of GDP. And you can look through those numbers of the UK and Germany, 17 and 22%, Australia 16%, Hong Kong 10%. These are huge, huge, huge numbers. And of course, eventually this money has to be repaid or recouped in some form or another. And it's coming in various forms. It's coming in loans and loan guarantees. It's coming in direct cash subsidies to help employers pay their employees and keep them employed. And some of them are direct payments to individuals that have been already displaced as a consequence of COVID-19 and the various social mobility restrictions that have been put in place across the world. In terms of the airlines' immediate responses, insofar as the passenger health and well-being, and obviously the well-being of our customers, our passengers, and the crew and the people that work in the airline is always paramount in aviation. There's been a lot of flexibility, of course, on rebooking policies and fee waivers. Pretty much all of the major airlines have significantly relaxed criteria for maintaining frequent flyer status, some right out to the end of 2021. But again, very, very quick response in terms of consumers that had booked or still needed to plan travel, because let's keep in mind, there still is a reasonable amount of travel being undertaken in some countries, but flexible rebooking policies and waivers of change fees and so on was implemented very, very quickly. I've already touched on the frequent flyer part of it. Seating policy to allow for the social distancing, which given the current demand is obviously relatively easy to accommodate in terms of the number of passengers on aircraft. And that's something that obviously we need to keep in mind going forward. Again, airlines very quick to introduce enhanced cleaning procedures on board and at various customer touch points. And also, changes in terms of the way the in-flight product and service was delivered to to minimize and reduce human contact. This is, again, produced by IATA. It's a little bit of a busy graph, and I'll try and sort of step through it piece by piece. So the blue line that starts in 2016, above the zero line, is the global RPK growth. So RPK is a revenue passenger kilometers, so it's a measure essentially of passenger volume. And what you can see there for the last 5 years or so, very, very strong global traffic growth. And that won't come as a surprise to anyone. I'm sure that's part of this webinar. Most of you are involved in tourism and travel in some form or another. And it's been a very, very strong performance. That's evidenced by the amount of investment that has been going into startups and enterprises that are focusing in the travel and tourism sector. So we've come off the back of a period of probably unsurpassed growth when you look at over the history of aviation, with a significant number of the world's airlines making profits and delivering a reasonable return on invested capital. 2019, there was starting to be a little bit of an underlying slowdown in global RPK growth. IATA did revise its forecast in 2019. I think around the middle of the year, or just before the middle of last year, they were forecasting around $30 billion of profit for the industry, and those forecasts were revised. I think it must have been around July or August. I think the number, as I said before, came in around 26 billion. Where you can see that dotted pink line where it says impact of recession only, what that is attempting to forecast is if this was an economic recession that didn't involve the pandemic, it didn't involve COVID-19, that is the type of decline that, based on historical data, we could probably expect to see. As you can see, somewhere, around 5, 6, 7% through 2020, recovering as you move into 2021. Of course, we have to overlay that with COVID-19 and the impacts. And what you can see there, as you follow the firm blue line as it moves below the zero, is the significant reduction in global traffic as a consequence of all the things that we've just spoken about. And the Q3 and the Q4 arrows that you can see pointing up, again, this is just this is a forecast, and it should just be taken as that, but predicts or demonstrates, I guess, the phasing of what we may see in terms of recovery. And the first is a recovery in the domestic markets. And I think that's probably a pretty good assumption to make, that the domestic markets are far likely to recover first. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the clear reasons, of course, is that in terms of the unwinding of government restrictions, that the international arena is going to be slower. I think, Caroline, you were saying in your introductory comments that President Macron of France was making some remarks around EU borders being closed for international travel for some period of time, going right through the summer. I hadn't seen that comment or heard that comment, but I think there's a general assumption that as we start to see social distancing and mobility restrictions lifted, we'll see a recovery in domestic. And that's because within countries, it's the remit and the, if you like, the decision-making ability of governments to enact policy changes that affect their own domestic markets and affect their own countries. The unwinding of some of the international travel restrictions is more complex, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But you can see there that this is not predicted to be a quick recovery. when we look at the economic sentiment, the same piece of research that I alluded to before, pretty much somewhere over 50% of people that were surveyed are all predicting a very slow return to global GDP growth. Very, very few are expecting to see any kind of V-shaped recovery. And of course, the profile of the return in GDP growth will be very much dependent on what happens as there is an unwinding of domestic social distancing restrictions and the gradual unwinding of some of the international restrictions and the consequential impacts of what happens to consumer demand as these restrictions are unwound, and we'll come to that point in a moment. But as I say, it's very hard to predict any kind of with any kind of reliability, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that the OneWorld Airlines or I are putting a huge bet on those growth profiles described by IATA. It's a model, but I think directionally it looks to be correct. Directionally meaning that we'll see a recovery in domestic markets and short-haul markets for the reasons I've already just mentioned, before we start to see some level of recovery in the international markets. So what are the factors that are going to influence the return to travel? Well, there are three listed there, but the first two really comprise the factors that are going to influence demand. And let's just talk about that for a moment or two. So sentiment among travelers, first and foremost, what I'm referring to there is customers, people, travelers, and in fact companies, underlying sense of confidence that it's safe to travel again. And I think that's a very, very important thing to understand, that the sentiment is going to be a critical element. How do we instill confidence in travelers that it is safe to travel? And a significant part of that will come down to the steps that governments make. Because as governments start to unwind social distancing, they'll only do that in the context of a belief that the rate of infections for COVID-19, the capacity to manage any ongoing new cases in what has been an incredibly stressed, globally stressed healthcare infrastructure, governments will unwind those restrictions when they feel confident or at least comfortable with the fact that there is the capacity to be able to test, there is the capacity to be able to treat people that are seriously ill and admit them to hospital, that there is the capacity to be able to monitor those that have been infected, and that the underlying numbers are coming down, the underlying deaths are falling, and the underlying rate of new infections is falling. And the underlying and total rate of total people infected is reducing. And in the countries, and again, Caroline has mentioned one or two of those, we are starting to see, particularly in Europe, continental Europe, some level of unwinding of these social distancing restrictions, whether it's schools or certain businesses being able to open. And that will play a big role in terms of sentiment amongst travelers, because people have been required to socially distance, to work from home, to stay at home. I think psychologically it's going to be interesting, it's going to be challenging, I think, for some people when those restrictions are lifted. Am I really safe to go outside? Am I really safe to start to use public transport again? Am I really safe to do some of these things? So that will take a little bit of time, I think, for people to get that renewed sense of confidence that their underlying safety and health is not at substantial risk. So I think there's a big role that everyone has to play in that, governments, but also media as well. I think it's very, very important that, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's an artificially positive spin put on things, but what I'm saying is let's make sure that we're very factual, relying on data, and we're providing people with information, informing them sufficiently so they can make choices. So sentiment's going to be crucial, I think, in terms of demand, and then the economy, and we'll sort of unpack that into two pieces. So first of all, if we talk about companies, businesses, what level of confidence do those companies have in terms of the economic outlook and the outlook for their own businesses, to start to allow employees to travel. And the second part of that is with consumers and leisure demand. Again, a number of people, huge numbers of people have had their employment affected. Some people have been temporarily furloughed. Some people have lost their jobs permanently. Many people have been operating on subsidized programs supported by governments. But a significant number of the population have seen their income fall away. And leisure travel obviously is a discretionary item. So to what extent are people going to be impacted by that in terms of, if you like, trying to recoup income that they have foregone over this period, trying to pay down debt for those that have incurred debt and maxed out credit cards and so on over this period. So the sense of the economic impacts in terms of people's sense of security of employment, and the real numbers that they're seeing in their own household accounts are going to be very, very important in this. So and I think the positive thing to think about there is that there's a huge amount of government stimulus that's been put in. I would say described almost as, economic triage. The measures that have been put in place are to slow up the rate of decline, but also ensure that companies are able to retain the talent and the people that are essential to those enterprises restarting. And once they restart, I think the confidence will start to build once the restart happens. So those two elements, the underlying sentiment with sense of safety, health and well-being, the economy itself, what sort of trajectory we're on. We are certainly going to see a massive global GDP decline year on year for the second quarter. That goes without saying. I think people are probably already conditioned to that. I think it's what people are seeing in the forward-looking data and the trajectories going forward that is going to be a big influencer both for companies and also for individuals. And the third element there is the government and regulatory policy side. So, we've already touched on domestic unwinding of social distancing. That's obviously, within the remit of individual countries and the governments and authorities within those countries. But also what's going to be the impact in terms of what are going to be the triggers in terms of unwinding some of the international travel restrictions. And that's a very complex piece. And I think in the limited amount of time we have today, we could spend a lot of time talking about that. I think the reality is that at the moment, we don't know. As most people are aware, when the travel restrictions were introduced, it was done relatively independently. So government of country A imposes travel restrictions on country B. That was largely happening without a lot of dialogue, if any dialogue, between countries A and B. Right? So, and that's not a criticism. It's just the fact that governments acting quickly and taking steps that they felt were the right steps to take. Through IATA, what we'd like to see is probably a better defined process in terms of the unwinding of that. And we're already seeing some governments some countries starting to engage in discussions with others. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of days that China has apparently opened up dialogue with neighbouring countries in terms of what sorts of conditions might be acceptable in terms of relaxing some of those travel restrictions. And I think it's important that we follow these developments very quickly, because when we start to see that happening, it's probably a very good early indicator of where we're going to start to see some recovery in demand. And it will be, I think it will be, region by region, area by area. So IATA are very actively engaged in this. And also, it's important for me to mention that I talked earlier about the 3 global airline alliances, OneWorld, Star, and SkyTeam, and we comprise almost 60% of the global capacity. I have to tell you that even though obviously we compete with these alliances in terms of our day-to-day business, we've been collaborating very closely in supporting the IATA program and agenda, starting with calling out to the slot regulators for alleviation. What I mean by that is that airport takeoff and landing slots, not everywhere, but generally are governed by regulations that within a given period of time, operating season, summer or winter, that 80% of the slots that airlines have been allocated have to be utilized for them to retain them for the corresponding season the following year. I hope I'm not making it too complicated. But we, IATA, the alliances and the individual airlines, of course, themselves have been very effective in terms of communicating to the regulators the importance of relaxing those rules. And the regulators have responded very positively to that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that collaboration amongst the key industry bodies, IATA working with ICAO, the World Health Organization, and other key government stakeholders is crucial. And the 3 airline alliances we're communicating on a regular basis. We're very aligned in terms of our thinking. We're all facing the same challenges, and we're working and collaborating with IATA closely, not in just supporting their agenda, but also to some extent helping influence it on behalf of our member airlines. So those are the key elements that are going to influence the return to demand. And let me now move to, which I think is the last slide. And this is the,
Rob, I sorry to interrupt you just a second, just to tell you we are in a tight schedule, so I will give you 2 more minutes to finalize this slide so we can try to keep it within the time we have today. Thank you so much.
No, thanks, Caroline, and sorry, because being an airline person, we should be always on time, so I'll try and move through this very quickly. This last slide is pretty straightforward. Again, what this takes is a piece of research that IATA did, conducted in 11 countries. And what it shows is in February versus April, intention to travel. And what you can see there, and I guess to cut to the chase and to move relatively quickly, if we move to the right-hand side of that, it's a relatively small percentage of people totally, around 12% on the latest survey, that don't see travel for the foreseeable future or wait for a year or so. The vast majority of people will travel in a relatively short time frame. And I think this comes to the point around pent-up demand. There is certainly pent-up demand. There's pent-up demand for business travel because companies that need to travel to go and see their colleagues, their teams, their customers have not been able to do that freely. So there's absolutely certainly pent-up demand for that. And there's certainly pent-up demand for consumers as well, because we have become accustomed to being able to travel. We've enjoyed, our generation and preceding generations have had the benefit of being able to travel. We've created a global structure. So I think the underlying pent-up demand is there, but it will come back to obviously ensuring that that people feel safe and not putting their health at risk in doing so. And that's, I think the sentiment is going to be one of the big underlying factors in terms of the immediate restart. The thing I haven't touched on, of course, is prospects of effective treatments for COVID-19 and vaccines. There's varying estimates on the time before those things will be available, vaccines probably further out, were generally the consensus 2021, but effective treatments could be available much earlier. And those elements, particularly effective treatments, which appears to be likely in the shorter term, those are things that are going to make a big difference in terms of sentiment as well. So I'm going to stop there because I have run over time. I think we're on to some questions. So I'll throw back to Caroline to pass any questions back to me.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much for this presentation and exploring the macro trends in this situation, trying to take a higher and global stand on what's happening and what's unfolding at the moment. We have received many questions, and as we are running a bit out of time, I will just ask you one, and I propose to work on answering this question in a written way that will be sent by email to our attendees
Sure.
after the webinar. So we have a question regarding, so I will read the question to you. Being under such financial pressure, will airlines, especially the legacy carriers, be able to provide service and safety like they did before the crisis? And will fears for this influence traveler sentiment?
So I think I've already covered the second part of that question. That is going to be crucial, but the short answer is yes. Of course, airlines will provide the absolutely appropriate level of safety and well-being for customers and the crew. That has always been paramount in terms of aviation, and will remain so always at the top of the priority list. You've already seen the steps that have been taken already. And the airline industry will be working very closely with governments and other regulatory bodies in terms of ensuring that we collaborate effectively to ensure that customers can travel with confidence and safety.
Thank you so much, Rob, for your answer and for taking the time to share your perspective on the situation today. It's now time to turn to Sergio. Sergio Merino was the co-founder of iVisa, and iVisa enables travelers to process visas digitally from their home. And we could think that we might need that a little bit more very soon. So Sergio, the screen is yours.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, that was great. It's a good segue into actually my presentation. I'll try to make it a bit short since it looks like we're short in time. But basically, I'll try to not over tell the things that Rob already mentioned in his presentation. Let me see if this is working. All right, here we go. Excellent. So I tried to actually structure the presentation around the current situation in the present, the past, and how the future will look like. I also tried to accommodate this to the audience, and we've been doing some research within iVisa to see, how flight and hotel would be impacted. So I hope you find it interesting, and also we're gonna touch a little bit into the documentation needs that we're already seeing in the world, right? So probably this slide is not new to anyone, but I thought it was pretty interesting to see actually, that this crisis is not going to look into any sector in specific. So the market cap of year-to-date industries is on average minus 25%, and obviously air and travel is one of the worst hit industries with an average minus 45% in market cap. As you've probably seen, Airbnb actually went from a 31 billion valuation to an 18 billion valuation. Booking.com is also taking 1 billion in capital equity, in private equity capital at a very low valuation, and probably the same thing is going to happen with Expedia. So basically we went from a time of abundance to a total new arena, and that was pretty well actually explained by Rob. So what's different this time? It's that this time is not a crisis of cash. There's actually plenty of cash, and that was well explained by Rob. So governments are pouring cash, private equity has cash, VC has cash, but one of the main problems this time is it's a supply shock. So it first started in China, where supply chain was broken. So as soon as the fabrics stopped producing, the world stopped. And this has moved on as the virus spread. So in the moment the virus went to Italy and then to Spain, we saw that companies had to start stopping, their service, and the supply basically dried. So, for example, Boeing and Airbus have cut their production 40% and 30% respectively. And the same thing happened with, obviously, hotels closing their doors from one day to another. And this is not only specific to the travel industry, but basically hospitality is the same thing. Even cinema theaters, big restaurants. So supply went from 100 to 0 overnight. And what will happen likely is that over time this year, supply will start opening up gradually, but it won't likely happen overnight or a V shape as Rob was mentioning. I thought this analysis by McKinsey was pretty interesting. So it was kind of giving estimates, and again, these are all estimates. No one really knows what's going to happen. It all depends on government sentiment and actual customer response. But it gives sort of a good idea of more or less what we can expect over the next year or two, right? So we see some industries such as oil and gas that have been really hard hit with the crisis, with actually oil going to negative prices on Monday. But as soon as the lockdown eases up, people will actually need oil and gas. So it makes sense to assume that that industry is going to start ramping up a bit earlier than air and travel. So it looks like air and travel is going to start ramping up over the next few months, especially domestically, as Rob was saying, and we are likely looking at international travel resuming at the end of the year, Q1 or Q2 in 2021. So actually, at least in iVisa, the projections we're making to start seeing some international travel is Q1, Q2 2021, right? So we think it's going to be a long road, but it's like what we've seen in the past, right? So this is a good segue into actually the next part of the presentation. So how or what have we seen in the past within the travel industry, right? So again, myself, I'm an optimist as well. So I wanted to look at over the last 100 years, but we only found data for the last 30 or so. And we see the travel industry is one of the most resilient industries in the world. And what was impressive for me is to see that in 2019 we had 1.5 billion arrivals, and that number had doubled over the past 20 years, basically, right? So in 2000 there was around 700 million arrivals. And even though we had like major crises in this period, which were the 9/11 or the 2009 global economic crisis, it's impressive to see that the industry has pretty much grown on an average of a 4% year on year, right? And what's most impressive is that tourism generates around 7% of global exports and 1 out of 10 jobs. So it's hard to imagine a world without tourism. And even though we are, in a terrible situation today, and probably we haven't hit the bottom yet, it will eventually rebound. So there is always a silver lining here. And again, that goes a little bit in the future and how we see the trends of travel domestically and internationally in the future. And, we've performed a few surveys as well, sentiment surveys, and we've also done some research. So I thought it was interesting to show some of the data that was collected by Luggage Hero, which is actually one of Bidroom's partner. They conducted a sentiment survey of their travelers, and they were asking actually about, what are they going to be doing with their travel in June to December 2020. And specifically, I thought it was interesting to see whether people are considering to cancel or not their tickets for the rest of the year. And what was impressive is that almost 80% of the people would actually travel if there's no quarantine in their home country or in their destination country, right? So as long as the countries are open, people are still willing to travel, right? So, it's a different thing that countries will open or not. So yes, we're all seeing that pretty much every single country is in lockdown, and it's going to take a little while to open back up. But the people's sentiment is that they still want to travel, right? And what was actually very interesting in this research we did as well is what are the changes that we are going to expect over the next years to come, right? So when 9/11 hit, we saw that basically we went from having zero controls at airports and airplanes to actually having to go to the airport 2 or 3 hours before to do the security checks, and like you can't carry liquids, and this all seems very standard today, but if you think 20 years ago, that would have been crazy, right? So for sure, this crisis is going to bring some changes, and we're already seeing some of them, right? So specifically in the documentation sector, what we're finding, and I guess Asia are the first movers here since the virus started there, and they had a bit more time than the rest of the world to work on this. We're starting to see that countries are asking for health certificates to get in. So some of them are actually doing a digital process where you need to actually get your digital certificate before traveling, or when they actually open their frontiers, they will require travelers to get one, a visa, and two, a health certificate, right? And that will probably be coupled with health checks before boarding. So we saw that, for example, in Emirates. Emirates is already doing that, and I'm sure countries are going to be doing, health checks upon arrival, right? So for sure, we're going to have more tighter border control, at least at the beginning, and then it will ease up. Hopefully, it will become more and more electronic, but likely we're going to see more and more border control, right? Even in Europe, Germany is talking already about immunity certificates to let people walk in the streets. And Austria is actually asking for, doctors' certificates to enter the country, right? So we expect these type of, border control changes in the countries, because we're already seeing them, and every single day we see one new country talking about this, right? Travelers' behavior, right? So what we think, again, and this goes very much in alignment with what Rob was saying before, is that people are going to start traveling more domestically, at least in 2020. And that fact was actually corroborated by these question in the survey. So basically, people in 2020 are considering to replace their international travel with domestic travel. So in the world, 44% of the respondents were saying they would change their international travel with domestic one. That for me, it's quite impressive, because still 50% of the people are, pretty much keen on traveling internationally. But we do believe, and it does make sense, that 2020 will be more of a local type of experience for travelers, right? So that goes very well with the travel motivations. And this is an internal interview we did with our customers. And what we're seeing here is that, people are actually going to be looking for more type of outdoors travel, less crowded areas. So probably they don't want to go to big cities, at least at the beginning. And there is a big uncertainty in future prices. So Rob also touched on this point. We've seen a lot of hypotheses here. So some say there will be low fares because airlines will want to ramp up operations and keep their planes busy. But it's likely that since supply will be lower, prices will go up. So we need to see how that will play out in the midterm and long term. But that's a big uncertainty right now. And for sure, there is a lot of millennials in our customer base. What we see is that they used to make long trips, make a 6-7 hour flight to spend a weekend in their destination and go back to their home place. it's likely that these type of trips are going to not be very popular in the short term, especially because, there's going to be more sort of preparation in the trip, and all these sort of restrictions in the short term that we're going to see in destination are going to probably make people go for the longer term type of stay, right? So it's going to be a change of behavior in the customers, right? And a few interesting things that we've seen. We already talked about Emirates doing health checks pre-boarding, but also it looks like there's going to be a big shift towards contactless, right? So for example, in China, pretty much all restaurants that are opening up are having a contactless experience, and this could be assimilated probably to hotels. So basically, there is a long distance between the customer and any clerk, and then when they actually go to the tables, it was impressive to see a few videos about this happening in China, where you see customers sitting one person per table, and then you have to have one table empty between customers, and every single person looking in the same direction, so you're not breathing into other person directly, right? So this is going to have an impact, obviously, in capacity and turnaround times, but that's going to force the whole industry to innovate. And we've seen that, for example, in the Formula One, where they've I don't know if you guys seen it, but they basically launched a virtual Grand Prix. So we have the real pilots competing in an online game. So I don't discard to see some type of innovation over the next year or years to come within the industry, right? So the role of technology, we see, is going to be very important, and this goes back to the documentation at least part. That's what we know very well, and we're seeing that most countries are implementing these electronic health checks. There is a ton of apps that help you sort of monitor and ask yourself if you have contracted COVID, and then they can help you monitor and isolate cases. And most successful governments are actually using these type of apps to be able to maintain the virus under control. And when they see the virus is spiking up, they can put more pressure in certain zones of the city instead of the whole city, right? Obviously, that brings a new discussion, which is privacy, especially here in Europe, but we would need like a full webinar for that discussion in total, right? And I wanted to do a quick segue into what companies are doing today to sort of survive, at least in the travel industry, and specifically us, right? So, in the past, basically, in the past crisis, the companies that were able to thrive during the crisis were the ones that were more resilient and more disciplined. So basically taking fast, bold action at the beginning, divesting from any non-essential investment was key at the beginning, to then when they got out of the crisis, these companies were able to grow faster and stronger. Obviously, in the tourism industry, this is going to be hard because we're not going to be talking about obviously growing revenues over the next year. Instead, we're more on a survival mode, but it's important to think about what type of actions do we need to take today to be stronger tomorrow. And obviously, the first actions are going to be to survive and make your plans for the next 3-6 months, or make scenarios for 6, 9, 12 months actually, and think what are the super key strategic things that you need to be doing and what can you divest from. And from there, it's going to be like, let's see when the world decides it's going to be a good time to grow again, right? And within iVisa, actually, just as an example of what we've been doing here, we basically focus a lot on the speed part of, as soon as, the crisis came in, we restructured the teams, we slashed non-essential, projects, the products that we had that were still making revenues, we focus on them and we put special teams on them. We created special teams to tackle those products. So we sort of decentralized decision taking and let people work on their own. And that was actually also a fact that we're working remotely. So we went from partly remotely to fully remote, and that helped to sort of divide or decentralize the decision taking in the company. And we're as well analyzing what partnerships we can make. So we basically open up our technology through APIs to integrate with different partners like hotels or airlines. And basically we've been very focused on trying to not lose our momentum, which is going to be hard given the situation. But we know that this is going to be temporary, and eventually people will come back to travel again. So I tried to speed up a little bit to get this within time, and I think this is my last slide, Caroline.
Thank you, Sergio, so much for the presentation. So basically, many new things to take into consideration as a traveler as we go into the recovery, more border control, domestic travel, and health certificates, and hopefully the technology that will ease these processes and make our life acceptable. So there are a few questions out there. First one will be, who will bear the cost of these new regulations and this the impact on the cost of traveling? What will it be?
So I guess it's going to be a shared cost. So on the one end, we're going to see probably, as I was saying, airlines doing health checks pre-boarding, and the airline will bear the cost, although they probably will pass on the cost of the airline tariff. And obviously, when you get to the country, very much like the visa, governments are actually putting the cost of these health certificates on the traveler. We're not talking about big quantities, right? So these certificates are no more than $10 in general, $10 to $20. So we don't think it's going to be a stopper for the traveler that actually want to go to a new country. But at least for now, what we're seeing is that governments have decided to put that cost on the customer, on the traveler.
Thank you, Sergio. So the same here, we have some other questions. So I propose that we just answer to it afterwards, and we can send it to our attendees by email as a follow-up. So it's now time to turn to Stig. Stig, thank you for your patience. You're the last panelist today. Stig, you are managing international partnerships at Avis Budget Group, and we are happily partnering with you at Bidroom. Stig, we are now listening to your presentation covering new travel realities, the car rental market, and innovation that are pushed forward by the company in the present context.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you for having me. I'm sitting here in my home office in sunny Wales. I'm sure many of you out there are sitting in your home offices as well. So let's just go straight into the presentation since we are running out of time. Just very quickly, obviously I'm working for Avis Budget Group. We are worldwide. We are in 187 countries. So obviously different kind of situations in different parts of the world we have been used to, if that's being sort of circumstances like local wars or down to hurricanes, etc. We're used to it. What is the difference this time is that this is impacting many parts of the world and impacting a lot of how people's behavior are in the different worlds. So let's come back to that a little bit later on. But I just wanted to mention as well is that Avis Budget Group, we have many different brands. Maybe one of the most known of them is Avis, high-end brand, and Budget, more lower brands in more economy brand, and Zipcar, the world's biggest car sharing club. So so going then over to COVID-19, obviously, as we have spoken about already, these are affecting most businesses. For us, it's absolutely affecting the inbound business. For us as a car rental company, we also are doing also mini lease and long-term rentals as well. And we can see that domestic haven't been affected as much as the inbound business. So we're very lucky in that sense to have that domestic business in the countries where this is possible to still be done. Going a little bit back to what Rob said, it's absolutely quite clear in Europe as well that the air traffic have absolutely declined. This is some statistics on the 15th of April April, we can see that most of the European countries have numbers up to like 95% decline in traffic. We can see that Norway are more than 50% decline in traffic, but Norway have also a loss of domestic travel. So that's why maybe the numbers are looking slightly better, but huge declines everywhere. And also going back to IATA's numbers as well, they're also expecting a bigger declines also in Q2, Q3, and then they're expecting only 10% decline to compared to last year for Q4. So obviously, we know, we can see the media per today, how many of the airlines are struggling as well. The question is, how quickly can we come back to some kind of normality? Very much so dependent on the governments and opening up borders. Obviously, that's totally out of control for most people and most companies. So we have to wait and see. But I personally believe that we will continue having some kind of social distancing as well in the near future. And obviously, I don't know if you have listened to the CEO of EasyJet. He suggested that they may take out the middle seat and keeping more distance in the aircrafts. Obviously, this will be also a huge challenge at the airport, infrastructure, etc. And also talking about EasyJet, they believe that they will not come back to pre-crisis levels before in 2022. So it's also an indication of how much this is also going to affect us in the future. We also have seen some restructuring done by Lufthansa as well, reducing some of the aircrafts and getting rid of, for example, the Airbus 380. So they're really preparing for a slow return to travel. So this is also going to be interesting to see when we are back to some kind of normality. I believe, and looked into some research as well, is that obviously everyone is sitting at home now. I'm sure we all are dreaming about traveling again and doing what we normally do. But again, it's indications that people will travel to places where it's not too many people. And maybe going back to my home country of Norway, going to fjords, going to places where you can walk up in the mountains instead of going for city breaks. So it's evidence that maybe people are going more towards that kind of way of traveling. Obviously, people are also more concerned going on the public transport and places where there's lots of people. And we can also see indications from some parts of the world already, like in China, but also in Scandinavia, when they're starting to opening up a little bit more, that we can see that we are getting new customers who want to rent or use mini lease because they don't want to go onto public transport, just to feel more protected as well. So, and at the same time, I believe that domestic travel will also increase now over the period we see going forward, and staycation will be more popular. I think that us as an industry need to work together. We maybe need to come up with inspiring driving routes where you can stay at different hotels and you can see more of your own country until we can start to travel again as what we have done in the past. So I had lots of conversations with the different loyalty schemes of the biggest airlines of the world. They also prepared that they need to focus more on domestic travel, focus more on domestic services as well. And obviously we at Avis Budget Group will absolutely take part of that as well to promote the opportunity to see more of your own country as much as travel when that's coming back to some kind of normality. And as also what's been said before, because of the social distancing, I also believe that more people will use self-service. I think both when you're traveling and going to the airport, flying, but also for ourselves, when you are using car rental, I expect more people to use more self-service app, etc. And that's leading over to what we are doing at ABG as well. For us, is very much so about innovation. We are working with the likes of Alphabet regarding Waymo driverless cars, but we also are working very much so on connected cars. Connected cars means that customers can use the Avis app, and they can use the app to open up the car and they can drive off. That means that they don't need to go into into a rental location. And that means also that connected cars can open up, that we can park cars in lots of the hotels which are represented on this call today as well. And our joint customers can use the app to open up the car and drive off. But it's all about trying to find new ways. Like Zipcar, the world's biggest car sharing club, we were the first one to open up for flex, in the sense that you can pick up the car and drop it off in a different location as well. And use of this kind of services, we will absolutely see increasing as well when people want to keep the social distancing. And therefore we expect people to use more our app and use the functionalities that they can do changes, upgrades, they can locate the car, and they can open up the car and drive off. But also in the future, maybe when it's allowed to use driverless cars on the streets, just like with Waymo, maybe people doesn't want to sit in a taxi anymore with a driver, just because they want to keep that social distancing and in one way feel that they are more protected in their own car. So that was a very speedy presentation, but I know we are running out of time. But obviously, Avis can be also a revenue opportunity for lots of the hotels which are on this call. Very happy for them to contact me as well if they want to do something jointly as well. So thank you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Stig. And on the last point you touched, so how to drive new revenue streams. With partnerships such as Avis, we actually covered that subject last week, and we have a webinar recorded for the people who missed it on imeethotel.com. So feel free to go there and have a look. So what I remember from your presentation is basically, and also from you, Sergio, is that technology will be there to play a role to help and ease with social distancing and new regulations that should be enforced. We're going to actually tackle that subject in the next webinar. So thank you, Stig, so much for the presentation. I will, as we are running out of time, I actually have a last question from the audience that can be actually for the three of you regarding price strategies. And how do you think that companies such as Avis or Airlines or you at iVisa will actually play around prices, discounts, higher, lower prices in this recovery period? Maybe Stig, you can start.
Okay, obviously all depending on demand, and as a car rental company we have the beauty that we can also defleet, in the sense that we can have a smaller fleet than normal if we feel the demand is not there, for trying to keep the prices more or less at the level we have seen pre-crisis. However, if the demand is not there, the prices will also fall. So let's see, our revenue management will look at this with their glasses on and see how they can take that forward.
Thank you, Stig. Rob, do you have a comment on that question?
Yeah, sure. I think I agree with Stig. I mean, it's going to be demand-led. Excuse me. I think there's going to be clearly some need for market stimulation to kickstart things at some point. But I think the timing, the sequencing has got to be very carefully thought through. There's no point engaging any kind of market stimulation activity if some of the other core fundamentals are not addressed. But I'm sure you'll see a variety of stimulative activities by the carriers. And I think you'll see large support from governments. A number of governments have already pledged support, particularly those whose economies are very dependent on tourism.
Thank you, Rob. Sergio, did you have a comment regarding prices?
Yes, I can't agree more. This is going to be very demand driven, and well, specifically in our sector, you know, once you decide to go to a destination, you know, the elasticity on the document price to get in is not that high. But again, we're also waiting to see how demand plays, to see whether we need to play with the prices a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise with us. As I said, we will be covering the different questions we receive all together afterwards. So I will just close these presentations for today with a few words that Well, basically, we've never been through anything like that before, so it's very difficult to know and to predict what will happen and what is the most likely scenario. But I think there are a few things that we talked about that we can be sure about more paperwork, healthcare certificates, new visa regulations, different new technologies emerging, and basically for the next year, a focus on domestic travel for most of travel companies. Also, of course, every product will be affected differently. I think today we talked about airlines, car rental, but if we look at an event company, probably the recovery will be much slower if we talk of companies like Cirque du Soleil, for example. So essentially, countries and regions are not made equals either, and wealthy markets with a strong domestic market may recover faster, as subsidies also there will be higher, as we've seen on the US market. So in a few weeks from now, there will be some new patterns developing, and we'll probably know a little bit more, and we'll be happy to share a new perspective on the situation as the situation evolves. So stay tuned with the next editions. So we will be back now in 2 weeks from now, as I was saying, to cover technology, revenue and innovation, and try to give you the keys to recovery with our hospitality experts. So you will receive the full recording of this seminar with answers to the unanswered questions. So thank you again to all our panelists and sharing your time with us again. And to everyone, stay healthy and good luck in this situation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.